Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for tonight's public workshop. We will begin now. Allison Higgins, if you would like to go ahead and make the introduction.
Hello, all. My name is Allison Higgins. I'm the Sustainability Coordinator for the City of Key West and the local contact for this project. I'm incredibly excited that so many of you have tuned in for our second of many opportunities to share and learn how climate change is predicted to affect our island and what we can do to be ready for that change. Did you know that there is a tidal gauge in Key West that has collected the longest run of data in the Western Hemisphere since 1846, 177 years? It tells the story of how the citizens of Key West have always adapted to sea level rise and provides our motivation to prepare for our new efforts. With that in mind, I want to introduce our guides in this process, Georgia Vince from Tetra Tech and Aaron Deedy, PA, who together have decades of experience in all things adaptation for communities big and small. Take it away, Georgia.
Georgia, you're on mute.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for calling in tonight. We're really excited to talk to you about an update on the vulnerability assessment progress that we've been making. My name is Georgia Vince. I'm with Tetra Tech, and I will be introducing some of our team here shortly. Today, we're going to do a project overview and recap of what we've been working on. We'll provide you with some preliminary results and the significance of those results. We'll look at some of the critical assets that we've identified to be at risk. We'll talk about our project schedule, and we'll get to some questions and answers throughout the presentation today. We really want to hear from you, so please do not be shy. Use the chat or question and answer button to ask questions. We're going to be using a survey methodology called Menti tonight. So if you've called in on your phone, you can open Menti in another browser, or if you're on your computer, you can use your phone to access Menti. I'll talk about that in just a moment. At the end of the presentation, we'll stick around for additional questions and answers. And we have a survey, a climate survey that we'd like you to participate in. As I mentioned, my name is Georgia Vince. I'm with Tetra Tech. Today, also presenting will be Aaron Deedy with Aaron Deedy, PA. Clearview Geographic is here. They're our GIS analyst. Search is our archaeological firm and cultural firm that is supporting the project. Brazaga is our outreach firm. The Balmoral Group is our economist, and Stantec is our partner in this project as they are doing other resiliency planning work in the city. So as I mentioned, we're going to use a survey methodology tonight called Menti, and you can go to menti.com or you can scan the QR code that's on the screen. I have a question coming up in the next slide for you, so please go to menti.com now. And if you open it up in a browser, you can enter the code 19930885, and that will be the code to access the questions. So I'll give everyone just a minute to go to your browser and open up menti.com. And you can enter the code and hit join. And I will move on to our first question of the evening, which is, did you attend the previous public meeting on the Key West vulnerability assessment? You can, the code is still on the top of the screen on menti.com if you didn't catch it from the previous slide. And we should have answers coming in live during the presentation. Looks like we have some newcomers here, so that's great. I'll give it another minute to let people respond to the question. Hopefully, everyone online is able to access menti.com and provide us responses. All right. Looks like we have 11. So we will move on to the next slide. Hopefully more folks will join us. So just a high level overview of the project that we're going to be discussing tonight. The vulnerability assessment is going to be evaluating flooding threats related to climate change that are currently impacting the city of Key West and looking at the community assets at risk. We will also be evaluating future risks and changes in the climate over time. This is a data-driven analysis and a multidisciplinary approach. There's a lot of specialty support that we have on the project, as I mentioned, with our teaming partners. We're going to be evaluating economic harm from climate impacts. We look to harmonize these efforts to address hazard mitigation at federal, state, and local levels. And we will be developing an adaptation plan to make the city safer and more prepared to respond to these impacts. And with that adaptation plan, we'll be identifying opportunities to fund these projects so that the city can become more resilient, and support from other funding sources will be identified. So we will be evaluating risks to assets owned and maintained by the city of Key West and the community resources. I'll be talking about those assets in detail later on in the presentation. We are measuring the impacts of the potential climate threats on certain areas and the level of risk that may be affecting those assets. We plan to prioritize our adaptation actions and develop a 10-year timeline. And those actions include infrastructure, historic and cultural resources, housing and shelter, power and water utilities, the environment, economics, and health and equity. The vulnerability assessment will help us understand the potential magnitude and severity of threats from extreme rainfall events, tidal flooding, current and future storm surge, and a combination of various sea level rise projection scenarios. And we will help integrate what we learned from all the analysis into the existing plans and codes that are applicable to the city of Key West. And again, we will be identifying future state and federal grant funding opportunities to help the city put forth the projects that we've identified. And just to talk a little bit more about grant funding, this vulnerability assessment and adaptation plan was 100% funded by grants. The city of Key West received $905,000 in funding to conduct a vulnerability assessment. That was through the DEP Resilient Florida program. You'll be hearing a lot about that program this evening. The projects in that we identify in the vulnerability assessment then become eligible for future grant funding at a 50% cost share. And in 2023-24 DEP projects, DEP is funding $100 million in projects. The city also received a grant for $500,000 to develop the adaptation plan. That was from the Department of Commerce through a community development block grant mitigation program. So the total project costs at $1.4 million are fully funded by these grants. And I'll hand it over to Erin to talk about the Resilient Florida Vulnerability Assessment.
Sure. So as Georgia mentioned, there are two different grants that are funding this combined planning effort. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the state portion of this, which is the vulnerability assessment funded by that program, the Resilient Florida program that Georgia mentioned. The program is very much focused on evaluating assets, and the statute that controls the program lists out the different types of assets that we have to evaluate in this planning effort. We have to determine the level of flood risk that those assets may be exposed to through what we call an exposure analysis. Then we also will gauge the sensitivity of that asset. For instance, if it is a park gazebo, that may have a different tolerance for flood risk than a water treatment plant or something that may be more important to the community's needs. And so we will look at both of those different types of risk associated with these various assets. We will prioritize those assets in terms of the greatest need and the greatest exposure and the greatest risk associated with those assets, so that we can kind of create a framework for prioritizing the most important things to the community first that are going to be impacted by these various flood scenarios. We will also be identifying adaptation strategies. Adaptation strategies may be projects, they may be programs or policies, or a combination of all of those things. We have additional public and stakeholder feedback that we'll be providing to the community along the way. And then finally, after we've undertaken this planning effort, we will identify priority projects that may be funded by future grants or other funding sources in the future. Next slide. And so these are the different climate threats. These are not all of the climate threats that we're looking at in the entirety of the program, but the state's portion that is funding this effort wants us to look very specifically at different types of flood risk. So we will look at sea level rise. We will be looking at both a intermediate low and intermediate high sea level rise scenario. So we'll have a range of conditions that we'll be evaluating. We look at high tide flooding. We look at storm surge. We look at rainfall flooding. And then we look at compound flooding. I like to call that the mashup scenario, where we'll be looking at things like tidal flooding, storm surge, and rainfall all at once, because we know sometimes those conditions may exist, especially when we get to that fall king tide season and you get a rainfall event on top of that. So we want to look at those compound flooding scenarios because they help us really evaluate when those flooding impacts exacerbate one another and what the impact to the community is. Next slide. And so you have a great tide gauge that we'll be looking at. It's got a very long period of record, which is helpful. And as this reflects, we have a NOAA, National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, low sea level rise projection and a higher sea level rise projection. So we'll be looking at that range of conditions based on very localized data. And what that translates into, if we're just looking at the high end of those ranges, by 2040, that's 7.2 inches of sea level rise on top of the 2000 condition. And it is 30.4 inches by 2070. And so those are the higher end of the range of conditions that we'll be looking at. Next slide. So we've got a question for you. There was a question in the chat about the code to engage in the Mentimeter tool, and that's 1993-0885. I hope I answered your question on that. And so which climate threats are you most concerned about based on this range of flood conditions that we have to look at in the state-funded vulnerability assessment? Interesting.
Yeah, we have a couple of responses coming in. Hopefully we get a few more.
So it looks like people are most concerned with those storm events and sea level rise for the most part.
All right, I think we have our 11 responders have responded. If anybody else would like to join, again, you can open menti.com in a browser, either on your cell phone or a separate browser on your computer. Go to menti.com and enter the 1993-0885. We have a couple more questions spattered throughout the presentation, so don't be shy. Feel free to join. Thanks. I'll go to the next slide.
So as I mentioned, this particular aspect of the program is really focused on assets that the community owns, controls, or may depend on. For instance, there may be an asset within your community that the city of Key West doesn't own and control. Perhaps it's a utility facility or a county facility. But these are the four different types of what we call asset classes: transportation, critical infrastructure, critical community and emergency facilities, and natural, cultural, and historic resources. And I do want to note in that number 3 category of critical community and emergency facilities, some of those things are not things that the city owns, maintains, and controls, like schools, like healthcare facilities, hospitals, emergency medical facilities. But the community depends on them. So you want to know where they are located within your community, and you want to know how much they are vulnerable to flood risk. And so we look at 39 different types of flood scenarios. This is kind of a graphical representation of what those are. We look at 2040, 2070, and 2100 conditions. We try to look at the present day, what's happening on the ground today with regard to rainfall in particular. We will add to that sea level rise plus tides. DEP defines that for us, which is sea level rise plus 2 feet of mean higher high water, which is the highest high tide of the day. We will add to that rainfall, and then we will add to that surge on top of it. And so it's 39 total scenarios that we look at under these various flooding conditions. And we will model and evaluate where the water will potentially impact the land and where it will potentially impact assets at the same time. Next slide. And so now we're moving into the adaptation plan. I've talked a little bit about the evaluation and what we're going to look at from a vulnerability perspective. Georgia's going to talk about what we're going to do about it through an adaptation plan.
Correct. So once we have all the results from the vulnerability assessment, we'll use that and some other research that has already started to look at the different components of the city and identify a list of comprehensive adaptation strategies. And that will include both structural and non-structural strategies at both a regional and community scale. And we'll prioritize these actions for a 10-year implementation timeline. Now, structural and non-structural, you know, most people are familiar with flood proofing, either wet proofing or dry proofing, raising roads, raising buildings, putting up seawalls, those types of adaptations. But there are also non-structural related adaptations as far as nature-based solutions or code revisions and things of that nature that we will be including in our adaptation plan. Our adaptation plan is going to be very comprehensive. It will be a 10-year plan, and it will have 7 chapters that will evaluate adaptation opportunities for infrastructure, environmental, historic and cultural resources, power and water utilities, economic impacts, and how we can adapt to those things that will be affected by climate change, housing and shelters, and health and social equity. So another question for the audience, which areas of the city of Key West do you believe to be most vulnerable to the impacts of flooding? Is it the coastal areas, non-coastal areas that are low-lying areas currently prone to flooding, critical infrastructure, residential areas, historic structures, or other? So get out your Menti device and help us with some of these questions, responses. All right, lots of answers coming in. All right, looks like we got 14 people responding now. That's great. Looks like the low-lying areas are really a main concern, and I think that makes perfect sense. We have 17 now. Great. All right. Thank you for your responses. I think I have a couple more questions. Before I move on to the exposure analysis results and the significance of those results, I wanted to pause for a second to see if anybody had any questions that posted to the chat or wanted to post or ask so far. Give it another minute and see if anybody has any questions, and then we'll move on. Erica, do you see any questions in the chat?
No questions in the chat?
All right, we can move on then and go through our exposure analysis. This analysis basically identifies the risks and helps us understand the level and the extent of the exposure from those risks, and very much focused on flooding. So we talked about sea level rise. Aaron gave you the expected influence from sea level rise. So this is present day. You can see some of the low-lying areas are outlined in green on this map. Moving to 2040, we can see some more inundation throughout the city with sea level rise. And then 2070, you can see that, you know, the real parts of the city that are at risk here. And then 2100. And let me just add a caveat to these maps. These do not incorporate any of the existing stormwater management infrastructure that the city currently has and owns and maintains. These maps strictly show a depth of water above ground surface. So you'll see some of the roads are a little bit darker because they're more prone to flooding or at a lower elevation than some of the surrounding areas. So these maps are strictly just a depth of water over the ground surface. No hydraulic or hydrologic modeling, just a GIS mapping effort, which is required by the Resilient Florida program. So for tidal flooding, you'll see in the scale on the right that we've identified areas that are going to be subject to more tidal flooding over time. So in 2040, we have some tidal flooding, and these are the king tides and the extreme high tides that Aaron was talking about, and the number of days that the land is exposed to these flooding depths. And as you can see, these high tides will encroach into the city boundaries little by little over time. Storm surge, again, remember storm surge is a short duration from a specific storm. This is storm surge at the 100-year event. So a 100-year storm hitting the city. This is present day expected depths of water in feet. Then we have 2040 and 2070, and I think you'll see, you know, the continued pattern of where the low-lying areas are more impacted and the higher areas stay a little bit drier throughout the city. For rainfall, these maps include rainfall, sea level rise, and high tide flooding. So here's present day. 2040, see the rain and inundation from sea level rise and high tide flooding increasing. 2070 and 2100. And then this is the combination, 100-year storm, 100-year storm surge, 25-year rainfall event, and shows the increase in water depths throughout the city over time. So you can imagine that combination event would be pretty catastrophic for the city. Again, this does not include any stormwater management systems that are in place, and it does include a storm surge, which is a short-term event during the hurricane from high winds and the event. So another Menti question for you. We want to know which adaptation strategies do you think the city should do more of by 2050 to address these future flooding risks? And is that stormwater management, elevate and retrofit buildings and roads, update codes and policies, or look to restore natural areas? All right. Getting some good responses from the audience. Appreciate that. All right, we got a few more people responding. Looks like stormwater management and elevating and retrofitting buildings and roads is getting a lot of attention here. All right, great. Stormwater management is high priority for this audience today. Great. We do make these, the results of these surveys available on the city's website, which I'll talk about later. So next we'll talk about sensitivity analysis. So this looks at all of the community assets that Aaron was discussing earlier and assesses the risk of the climate threats to those assets. So which assets are more at risk to these flooding hazards? So first, we prioritize the flooding areas generally where we believe the adaptation response should occur. We call those hotspots. And so we have identified several flooding hotspots, which I'll go through here shortly. We'll create an evaluation process to rank those asset types. So they are prioritized within the hotspots. We apply a ranking system to those assets within the hotspots, which helps us prioritize which assets need to be adapted. And then we identify the adaptation strategies for those prioritized assets, and those become our projects in the vulnerability assessment. So again, the hotspot criteria is a high number of critical assets that are at risk. The area is subject to sea level rise, storm surge, rainfall, or combination flood risks, either today, by 2040, or 2070. The critical assets include those identified by stakeholders and community members throughout these workshops that we've been holding. And the purpose of these hotspots is to help prioritize where adaptation response should occur based on the geographic area and the risk of those assets in that area. So we look at the flood scenarios, we look at the assets, and then we focus on where those assets are concentrated and they are at greatest risk. So this map shows the hotspots that we've identified for the city. The brown hatch areas are properties that are owned by the U.S. federal government. So the Navy properties that I'm sure all of you are familiar with. The hotspots are numbered from 1 to 12 throughout the city. So the 1, 2, 3, and 4 will be impacted earliest. 5, 6, 7 is the wastewater treatment plant. 8, 9, and 10. We have 11 over here by the Key West Golf Course, which includes the landfill. And then hotspot 12 is Stock Island. And as you may or may not know, not owned by the city or within the city boundaries per se, but certainly include a lot of assets that the city depends upon. And so we've included Stock Island in our vulnerability assessment. So just zooming in to hotspots 1, 2, and 3. This is the Upper Duval Street area, Lower Duval Street, and then over by Truman Avenue. 4 is over here on the waterfront. 6, I think if you were paying attention to the maps, you'll saw a lot of impacts over at 6, and then 7 again is the wastewater treatment plant. Here's 5 and 6, South Street, and the areas over by the beaches. 8, 9, and 10, and then 11 and 12. And the hotspots are essentially numbered in order of greatest risk. So the lower numbers will be at risk first, and the higher numbers will be at greater risk in the future. So let us know if you think that those hotspots accurately reflect your knowledge of areas prone to flooding in the city of Key West. All right, we got a lot of yeses, which is good. Couple of no's. We'll be asking for input from those who responded no later in the presentation. All right, wait, now a couple more responses maybe. All right. Thank you for your responses. I'll be moving on to the next slide. So once we have the hotspots, we look at the assets and we help the city prioritize those assets in a scoring fashion, a prioritization framework. We look at the planning horizons, the near-term impacts versus long-term, the water depth and flood risk. We include stakeholder input and social factors from CDC and HUD. And then we take that prioritization framework and identify high priorities, medium priorities, low to medium, and low priorities. So you'll see this color scheme throughout the next set of slides where we discuss the assets or share with you the assets within the hotspots. So this is hotspot number 1. The high priority assets include fire stations, pump stations, shelters, an electrical substation, potable water control valves. Medium impacts are childcare centers and some of the catch basins located throughout this hotspot. In hotspot number 2, we have an emergency operations center, very critical asset, some more shelters and pump stations and a fire station, a lot of catch basins and some drainage wells. Again, for those people that were concerned with stormwater management, those things will be included in the asset list. Jumping over to hotspot number 4, a lot of hotspots in this one, so we had to separate the maps so you can actually see some stuff. But the high priorities on the left and the medium is on the right. And so these include staging areas for emergency response, the Keys Energy Office, some microwave towers, substations, some more potable water infrastructure, sewer infrastructure, and stormwater infrastructure. And then the medium include gas stations, some injection wells, public schools, and some government facilities. And as you can see on these maps, the different colors represent the different risks. So high priorities are red, yeah, orange is medium, then yellow, and then green. This is hotspot number 5. Some more pump stations and stormwater infrastructure, catch basins, injection wells, and some trench drains. So a lot of stormwater infrastructure here that can be included in the vulnerability assessment. And here's 8, again, split out with high and medium so that we can see the real nitty gritty here. But we're looking at a hospital, some staging areas, some more energy fund substations, the FKA storage facility, also some mobile home parks, some pharmacies, and some gas stations in the medium. So what services and or facilities would be most critical to you during or after a climate event, a hurricane or a tropical storm, severe weather event where you get, king tides and excessive flooding from rain, things of that nature? All right, so water, wastewater, and electric, emergency services. We have 13 people responding so far. All right. Got one for transportation. All right, I think that's the last question we have for Menti, but we'll have opportunity for more questions at the end. Just kind of giving you an overview of what we've been doing and where we're going. We've done, a lot of data collection. We had a workshop in January. We've evaluated the climate hazards and risks according to the Resilient Florida program and those risks to critical assets. And here we are today at public workshop number 2. Next, we'll be identifying adaptation strategies for those assets, and we'll draft our vulnerability assessment report, which include focus areas and hotspots and prioritize projects. So we'll identify those adaptation measures and have another public workshop in June with the full results of the vulnerability assessment. We'll work to identify mitigation opportunities for flooding. We'll perform cost-benefit analysis, which means some projects may be too costly to implement and may not be worthwhile, but identify those projects that are worthwhile at pursuing. We'll look at funding sources for the projects identified during the adaptation plan, and then we will be having a public workshop next year to discuss the results of the adaptation plan. And that plan will include a 10-year timeline for implementation, so it doesn't end with the adaptation plan report. It will have a 10-year timeline and a schedule with costs and projects identified to be implemented every year over the next 10 years. We wanted to share with you a couple of project funding opportunities. As I mentioned in the beginning, the Resilient Florida program offers a 50% match. There's also community development block grants with multiple programs. FEMA has several programs like BRIC and hazard mitigation grants. NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, has coastal zone enhancement grants and emergency coastal resiliency grants. The Department of Interior has energizing grants for communities to help with their utility and energy infrastructure. The EPA has Clean Water State Revolving Fund grants, and there's plenty of other grant opportunities out there. We'll be evaluating those opportunities and including some recommendations in the adaptation plan. Here's a high-level schedule. We hope to have the vulnerability assessment and final public workshop in June. We look to have the draft adaptation plan and workshop in February of next year and final in August. And then again, we plan to help with the adaptation plan, implementation, and tracking over time. So the key takeaways from today is that the city has and will be affected by climate threats, and there are areas of increased vulnerability within the city. And the city is proactively addressing resiliency by doing the following: further reduce risks of flood and climate threats, align local, state, and federal resources with the needs of the community, and developing a focused and comprehensive approach to climate adaptation. As I mentioned several times, your input is needed. We really want some community input and feedback on our analysis and our results. So we have a couple of different ways that you can help. We have a community survey. You can use the QR code on the left to fill out a community survey. We also have a project newsletter, which you can read and receive. If you would like to email us, you can email us at keywestadapts@gmail.com and stay up to date on our project at keywestadaptationplan.com. So with that, I will thank you for your time, your participation in Menti today, and we will take any questions that you may have. And let's see if I can get the chat.
Georgia, we have 2 questions. One from Linda and one from Red. So let's start with Red. If you would like to go ahead and unmute yourself, you can ask your question. Well, I'll go ahead and ask on Red's behalf. So the question was, has the city contracted or directed the consultant team to provide any help or advice to homeowners on flooding mitigation for private property? They've been speaking to several neighbors and can't find any city provided resources specifically for property owners.
This is Allison speaking. I can actually put a link in the chat right now for a great resource on how you can elevate and or harden your own house.
Great, thank you so much, Allison. The second question is from Linda. Linda wants to know how Key West will coordinate with Monroe County's resilience efforts to integrate projects and reduce duplication.
That's actually a really good question. There are members of the team that are working on Monroe County's vulnerability assessment update. And we've coordinated and collaborated on certain areas, for instance, Stock Island, where a lot of the community within the city depends upon assets or businesses to be resilient within that portion of the community. But of course, that is unincorporated county. So we've already had one coordination meeting with the county on that. And I believe that we will have more as the project goes along. The county's vulnerability assessment is supposed to be finalized by September. So the outputs of the Key West project will be done a little bit sooner than the county's. But the methodologies to evaluate the flood risk, the flood scenarios, all of that is consistent across the two projects. So we know that the water elevations that we're planning for that type of thing is all fairly consistent. So Linda, I hope that answers your question. If not, we can definitely follow up.
I just wanted to add one component of the project that we didn't really talk about today is that there's a steering committee that we have identified where there's folks from different groups of within the city and also members of Monroe County Resiliency Office that are on that steering committee. So we do have that. We do have regular coordination with those folks as well.
Great. We have 3 individuals with their hands raised. Gerald, I'm going to unmute you and allow you to talk, and then we will get to Steve and Chris's questions next. Gerald, go ahead and talk. Gerald, if you would like to unmute yourself, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Okay. Gerald Ward, there is last Wednesday, a meeting which there is a $74 million cost, which is proposed to be inserted into the general obligation bond issue, which is going before City Commission in the May and June meetings for 2 ordinance readings. Where did that number come from, or how is it computed or devised?
Hey, Mr. Ward, it's Allison. Which particular piece were you referring to at the 74 million?
The adoption, which you presented Wednesday night or Wednesday afternoon.
That's 99 million. So it's not. We don't have the final number because we don't have this list of projects yet. So it is just a number.
Just inserted. Okay. So, and you say it was 99 versus 74?
It was 99 million.
Okay. I didn't go back and pull the 20-some page document. All right. I'll got some other questions when the other people get times.
Okay.
Steve, if you would like to go ahead and unmute yourself, you can ask your question now.
In the past, seen some reports of the county doing flood mitigation work on Flagler Avenue. And I know that there are plans to do some flood mitigation work here along Riviera Drive and the areas associated next to Flagler. Have those plans been integrated at all?
So I don't know if Rhonda's a guest on the call, so I'm going to do my best to answer, and we can follow up if we need to. I do know, I believe, actually, I should not say I know, I believe the county has received some grant funding to do some improvements along Flagler. I don't know if that grant agreement has been finalized. I don't know if it's been executed. I don't know the state of that, but I do believe that the county has received some money to make some improvements along Flagler.
And I know there's plans in the works to make stormwater sea level rise, storm surge, probably they're not the correct term, but anyway, work along Flagler in the city areas. And so it would seem to me that while I would hate to see any further delays in anything, it would be useful to make sure that, we're all pulling our oars in the same direction.
Absolutely. So I will follow up with the county and make sure that we've got that potential project information factored into the adaptation recommendations that would be coming out of the plan. Make sure, like you said, that we're integrating whatever the county's doing and vice versa.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Chris, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Hey, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay. The adaptation areas identified are sort of, patches. They're not, there's not any sort of linear feature that would represent the, the evacuation route that would get people from Key West and from Northern Stock Island to the main, to the highway or the upper parts of the highway. Is that just out of your purview, or is that something that you could identify as vital to make sure that that evacuation route is as high as it needs to be?
Yeah, I mean, Chris, to your point, and Alex is on the call too, there are two triggers that make a hotspot. One is that it's subjected to certain levels of flooding more so than other areas, therefore it kind of moves up in the priority list. The other thing is that it's got a lot of stuff in it, like a lot of assets in it. So if there's only one asset in a particular area, that's not an aggregation of things that we need to pay attention to. But to your point, I think a critical evacuation route can be identified, on these maps as such and called out that way. But at least our approach to identifying the focus areas is more kind of aggregation and is it triggering flood risk?
Yeah, that makes sense. It's sort of a linear asset that connects many of your
focal
areas together. Yep.
But let's talk about it with the team and figure out within the map series, if we're crossing a critical evacuation route, can we just indicate it on the map?
Right. And then I've got one more, if I may. The earlier mentee, it was like, do you like regulations, or do you like stormwater management, or do you like wetland restoration, etc.? But I think often these things can work together. So when you get into the formulation of responses or risk reduction strategies, or whatever you're going to call them, are you able to evaluate the combined effects of various adaptation options on any given action area?
Yeah, I think they're not exclusive. The adaptation strategies are not going to be exclusive. If we are working on an area that's immediately adjacent to a coastal area, it might include, raising a sidewalk, installing a higher seawall, and putting in, and including habitat restoration or something like that. So there can be multiple layers of an adaptation strategy for a particular asset, if that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, we have another question from Gerald. Gerald, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, I guess this deals in first the ranking systems that you just went through. Are those numbers going to be used at all again?
I'm not sure what your question is.
You had a half a dozen questions that you asked of the 13 or 14 folks that are on the line, supposedly. Some of them obviously were able to vote more than once. And I didn't realize that was an option. There was no, the questions were not put to anybody prior to the meeting. In other words, there was no agenda to say, these are the questions going to be asked. Are you intending to use the results that you just tabulated in any further reports?
Yeah, we'll be including that in the vulnerability assessment as input from the public. And if you would like to provide additional information, additional responses, we'll be including a link to this video recording and the presentation on the Key West website, the adaptation plan website. I can go back to that slide so you can see it. And then you can also email us. If you have any additional input, we're happy to hear from you.
Well, all right, that I would totally object to use of the stat. I don't think it's statistically valid at all. And I'd sort of give a side with this week we also had, or this last week we had what people want to call Duval, and it was originally started in 2020 for Simonton, Duval, and Whitehead Street revitalization. And the morning session apparently produced a lot of upset people that said, this is not what we were looking for, and we don't like it. So I really believe that you don't have a statistical basis nor a time basis for the questions that you ask. So then that goes to a recommendation that any future meeting be in person with a published agenda in advance, so that the community has a way to know what's going to go on and decide whether to come or not. I know you've got a lot of people on the hook that are far away. None of the consultants are really local, so nobody can walk across to the meeting hall. So we do need a in-person meeting for the rest of any of the operations.
Allison, do you want to, we are planning some in-person meetings in Key West. And, you know, we will be including the responses that we receive from the community in the report. And we're happy to take as much input as you'd like to provide us. That isn't going to be a statistical integration into the results of the vulnerability assessment. It's just part of one of the requirements from the state of Florida is that we gather input from the community. We've chosen to use Menti as an interactive way to gather input and data to help us make sure that we are leading in the direction that the community would like us to go.
Well, our last speaker made the point that sometimes you just don't want one of five or one of some number, that there has to be an integration of more than one solution to the pollution.
And I think I'd also say that while the Menti part, it's a little bit more for fun. We know that's a tiny little snapshot, but the QR code for the survey, that's a totally different survey. That's going to be up the whole year. And we're advertising it everywhere. So that one will be more from the community perspective.
Unfortunately, I'm not sure how to even use a QR code. So there you go. And there's a lot of people in Key West of the same ilk.
If you have signed up for our e-newsletter, you also get that straight as a e-news with a link, and it doesn't. You don't have to use the QR code. We sent it out both ways. It's also on the adaptation page as a link.
I'm sure, but right now I couldn't use it. I'm not sure how to do it.
I'll send it to you directly.
Steve has another question. Steve, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, following up on that last observation, I did follow the link to the survey, and there are a variety of multiple choice prioritization options in the survey. And either that part doesn't work very well, or I joined the challenge who couldn't make it work. But in any case, I think you guys ought to take a look at it. And if there are some instructions to make the prioritization work appropriately, that would be great.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions from our members?
Let's have a meeting agenda well in advance so we can advance it. The newspaper can put it out too. Then we start to get the real folks in town.
All right.
Just as a matter of additional interest, Gerald Ward, I will tell you that storm hardening and accomplishment of things like our operations center for the county up at Marathon Airport, even though that's in certainly a flood area, stormwater flood area, it is obviously well expended so that we don't have people running all over the county going towards the mainland to get out of a tropical event. And we also might need to consider that you can't foresee every event. And we used to take 100-year events were fine. We used 500-year events for Turkey Point nuclear power plant back in the late 60s. And now I think you're going to find more and more is to provide storm hardened facilities. You can put 1,000 people in the City of Key West High School auditorium for presentations. So there is a small area that could have been hardened for frequency events that may eliminate at some point in time evacuations. I think that is where most people feel that the expenditures for the normal sea level rise, and Key West has done pretty well since we now have from 200 years of experience in straight line sea level rise. So, and you did start off very nicely, I thought, with the fact that the tide station is the longest running tide station of the Coast Survey NOAA's operations. So we have good long-term data to plug in to the geologic data of sea level rise. That's the evidence for that long-term, thousands of years.
Absolutely, and I'll address your points. So, unfortunately, the school is right now, just a what was it, last refuge place. It's not even a official shelter. So, I believe that the school is one of the places that was called out in the Army Corps study as one of the places that needs dry flood proofing, which would help it along in that direction. We also got funding for our first resilience hub. So that's going to take the Bahama Village Community Center that's right next to the gym on Olivia Street and take it up to a Cat 5 building with solar and generator and water production so that it can serve in that capacity as well.
Okay, great. Are there any other questions?
I want to thank our hosts tonight and everybody that came along. We will put it back out in the e-newsletter. If you are not already getting the e-newsletter, you can send that email to kwadaps@gmail.com and we'll make sure that you get on the list. That's where we try to send all the information before the meetings. And it's also where you'll get the link to when once we've gotten this posted.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.